Okay. Welcome to the opening on Museums on Fire. My name is Anders Sunna. I have made this scene for this opening. I'm coming from Sweden, north of Sweden, Jokkmokk, but was raised in Keksesvara, close to the Finnish border. When I grow up, we learned that the darkness is our friend, strength and protection in our work. We are not afraid of the dark. I wanted to bring the darkness to the audience present here today, for the other artists and curators, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to engage with it. So just this sentence is very important for me, because when I was growing up, my parents and uncles and relatives learned that for us the darkness is useful because of our family history. We were quite not normal. Because it was in 1971, the Swedish government took away our reindeer herding rights. In 1981, they forbid our families, all reindeer marks was forbidden. And in 1986, it was when I was 1 year old, the Swedish government sent a police patrol to make force us away from the area during our reindeer herding, when we were marking the calves in the ears, and we didn't know nothing about it before. They just came and forced us away. And when they did this, they put up a fence that was 30 kilometers long, just for our family. During the 80s and 90s, my family get 300 to 400 police notifications on us. The police could bring my dad or his brothers to interrogation, like question them. The police took them from their home, and they can be sitting in the police station for like 6 hours straight, and yeah, stuff like that. And also that we were always not welcome anywhere in this place, in Pajala area. During the day, if you went to the city to the store and buy milk or whatever, people in this area could with knife cut our tires on the car, or writing crosses on the car, or houses or whatever. It was quite much aggression against us during this time. And that was why the darkness had been so good for us, so we can work it alone. And yes. So what we are sitting here today, it's like a really big painting that you can go inside in. Usually I make paintings, street art, and yeah, I like to paint on everything you can imagine. But I also wanted that the people here who is here is the captured one, and we are otherwise is outside this area. So you can see different people on the wall, or skeletons, and And during this time, we were fighting against the Swedish government, who took our reindeer rights because we didn't want to work for free or to pay to work to non-Sami people who own reindeers just for a hobby. And then we went to trials 40 times and still does it today. And during this time, we have never won a case in our lives. And when I was growing up, I have noticed that it's a bit different to have right and to get right, even you know that you have the right. And the beginning of 2000, we had a new lawyer, and this lawyer was quite important because he was a former judge, and he also had been at the same trials and judging our case. For the first time we met him, he judged against us, and the second time we had a trial again. He begins the trial to apologize to us because the Swedish government gave him the wrong information about us. And I want to show you a text that he wrote, a really short one, but yeah, you can read it. And for me, it's very important to use the power of the art to talk about this situation that never comes up in the light. But it also have been like a really good thing for me to just calm down and not to be so aggressive, because how this is affecting my childhood and what we have been through and still going through. So that has really been like protecting me for not getting too much militant. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it, maybe.
Både bjevi. God ettermiddag. Good afternoon. Whether employed for warmth and medicinal purposes, in the renewal of land and forests, or in a varied forms of communication, fire has been used by humanity since time immemorial for survival and as a central element of our cultural vocabulary. In today's modern geopolitical landscape, fire is mostly associated with pain, terror, and destruction. and we perhaps fail to ponder upon its generative powers. Museums on Fire is positioned in this space between times, a beckoning call to set alight the forms, processes, and languages shaping the modern frame of the art world, that we are part and parcel of, in a bid for transformation. One of the effects of the current phase of globalization is an increased effort to realign, or actually more or less remove, the boundaries between art worlds. Notions of center and periphery of old have been transformed under the impact of a widely dispersed globalized network. A principle of inclusivity is becoming an organizing force behind international art exhibitions and museum collections, as they race each other in the construction of a new global art history. Many scholars consider this movement to have commenced with a questioning of the flawed universality of modernism, the quest for alterity and pluralism that Jean-François Lyotard announced in his seminal text, The Postmodern Condition, of 1979, and the subsequent rise of post-colonial studies. For our context here in Norway, it's pertinent to note that Lyotard's study emerged at the very same time as the groundbreaking Sami uprisings between 1979 and 1981 of the Alta action, whose calls to let the river flow demanded cultural and ecological rights for the peoples and lands of Sápmi. But we can look further back in time to find entrenched critique within the early modernist ranks of the cultural field. Walter Benjamin, for one, in a text called To the Planetarium of 1925-1926, condemned the domination of nature by the ruling classes and added the liberation of nature to the revolutionary program. Earlier still, Karl Marx's writing in the mid to late 19th century addressed the notions of capitalist agriculture and soil ecology, even if they had been much neglected until recently. As author John Bellamy Foster argues in his book Marx's Ecology of 2000, Marx was a powerful critic of capitalist society and was deeply concerned with the changing human relationship to nature. Dissent was also to be found amongst early modern artists, such as Kazimir Malevich, whose important text On the Museum from 1919 protested against the new Soviet government's preoccupation with preserving old Russian museums and art collections from destruction by a rampaging civil war. His was a bid for an open window through which the revolutionary flames of radical destruction could enter the space of culture and reduce it to ashes. In their destruction, he saw a path to what he called true living art, otherwise suffocated by the deadly forces of the museum. Malevich's writings show us that much of the avant-garde of the first wave, often associated with notions of progress, especially technological progress, did not wish to create a new progressive art of the future, but rather a transtemporal art for all time. What the early avant-garde was perhaps asking then was how could art continue amidst the permanent destruction of cultural tradition and the known world of its time, and under conditions that are characteristic of the modern age, then as now, with its technological, political, and social revolutions. Or to put it in different terms, how does one resist the destructiveness of progress? Progress. Upon that call, 1,000 ships set sail across the waves towards so-called new land. The founding crimes of May arrogant ancestors, Spanish and British generations that devised some of the largest empires of all times, were characterized by invasion, occupation, and settlement of continents that spanned practically about 3/4 of the world, through finely tuned and still ongoing ecocidal and genocidal strategies. Within that context, it stands to reason that the creation of so many nation-states in the world today remain illegitimate. The destruction of indigenous communities through massacre, enslavement, dispossession, by theft and fraud and legal manipulation, the repression of their languages and cultures, economic coercion, corruption, demoralization. These histories have been recalled many times, and yet they cannot be voiced enough, particularly since many of these processes continue throughout the world today. And may I add, the Nordic nation-states are no exception here. As I consider what I, as so many amongst us, come from, and where I stand today, with the privilege and the power incumbent to a modernist art world and an organization such as OCA, it's clear that the inspiring forces for change and the most incisive critiques of modernity to be found right now are coming from indigenous thinking. A thinking that has for centuries articulated a refusal of modernity, social, economic, and cultural, and that today entails that dominant structures change, moving on from social forms and logics which are unsustainable and supported by inappropriate technologies, towards social forms and logics that are sustainable and supported by appropriate technologies. If we can agree that land cannot be owned in the modernist way through crime and atrocity, then it is not impossible to consider the return of stolen lands to indigenous peoples. Reparation schemes, which are easier to perform, could also be undertaken. And yet here in Norway, we know from recent governmental leaks that calls for such processes are being willfully suppressed. A vigorous national debate about the restoration of full indigenous self-determination could also be a start. It is, of course, for indigenous people to say what they want and need, and what they expect from non-indigenous supporters. And with this in mind, it is here perhaps where contemporary art can come in strongly, in the cultural re-articulation of the forms and methods of the contemporary art world, in the call for a decolonization of the art field that stands for a decolonization of society at large. If one is to believe the current world censuses, there are at least 370 million indigenous peoples in the planet, belonging to 5,000 different groups in 90 nation-states worldwide. Indigenous peoples live in every region of the world, around 0.06% of them in Europe, around 20% of them in the Americas, around 70% of them in Asia. Despite this planetary scope and global interconnectedness, colonial powers have and continue to expertly argue for the localness of indigenous experience in order to fragment, isolate, and render invisible their intellectual processes from the world stage, as they remain hostage within the frontiers of the nation-state. The suppression of indigenous histories, aesthetics, and languages, the undermining of circular time conceptions and spiritual practices, as well as the violent possessions of land, their colonial renaming, and subsequent exploitation, stand out as recurring mechanisms of colonial histories past and shamefully present in our times. Within these colonial realities, museums on fire considers the entanglement of art institutions in the colonial and modernist ideologies that created them, and asks artists, curators, scholars, both indigenous and non-indigenous, to consider the forms, spaces, and processes through which indigenous artistic practices should be addressed today, how their histories have been narrated in the past, and how they should be narrated or counter-narrated today. Indeed, what would a non-colonial museum look, feel, or sound like? Is it enough to widen the modernist art historical canon through the politics of inclusion? Is this broadening functioning instead as a new colonial model for indigenous practices? Or is it actually fostering the cosmopolitanness of thought that indigenous communities have always inhabited? And is the museum per se an obsolete model for indigenous practices? Should novel constellations of thought and practice be sought to affirm and mediate the indigenous discourses of the future? Within the context of Norway, we know that a Sami artist collection has been under construction since the 70s. And we know that a museum with the resources and person power necessary to activate such a collection within society at large has yet failed to materialize. We know too that in 2020, 2 large flagship museums will be inaugurated on the shores of the Oslo Fjord, the National Museum and the Munch Museum. We as yet know little as to what dialogue their museological processes will establish with Sápmi. To consider the creation of a Sami museum within this context has therefore much symbolic power, and yet, with such considerations must also come a reflection upon what such a museum could stand for. A replication of the modernist project, perhaps entrenched within a deep history of coloniality, or an opportunity to imagine a new structural cosmology. What stories should that project generate? Could such a space speak from the rains, the storms, the snowfalls, the pitch dark nights, the icy grass patches that watch the coming climate chaos? From the multiplicity of cultural and biological existences that stubbornly persist today despite their onslaught? From the land, the airs and the waters that surge with life, a life which is our existence into the future? And how should it address the artificial polarization of notions of the contemporary and of tradition that the modern art world so often places indigenous practices within? We know that modernism has claimed to be in conflict with tradition in its constant bid for the now and for the new. We also know that modernism itself has constructed the concept of tradition in such a way as to increase its own value against the supposed grain of tradition. As Eric Hobsbawm, in his famous book, The Invention of Tradition of 1983, tells us. So how could the constructed concepts of tradition and contemporaneity be exploded, therefore, through a museological project? And within the current art world's evident obsession with history, with the archival, and with traditional forms of making, what exactly would the contemporary stand for anyway? As Indigenous scholar Susan Fair tells us, most native artists don't spend much time contemplating or defining tradition, although they may be uncomfortable with how they are labeled in relation to it. Their work and words provide a cultural and aesthetic window through which to examine the foundation of a past that is always present, even if assaulted by forces. Tradition survives just below the bustle of everyday life in native culture. There is a bedrock of the past. Also significant within a discussion of an indigenous museology are a couple of more concepts that I will address briefly. Place. In striking contrast with modernity, which promotes a derooted floating condition across the globe, indigenous thought finds its ultimate source of values, ethics, justice, and spirituality in the land. So how would a museological project address such a land-centric and land-bonded ethics? Anthropocentrism, contingent with the devaluation of place, upholded by the logic of modernity, is a disconnection with and indifference to the ecosystems that define that place. How would a museological project therefore reorientate or rebalance its spaces towards what phenomenologist David Abram has called a more than human matrix? And last but not least, the question of how to unfold a decolonizing and indigenous methodology, one that escapes the embeddedness of imperialism within the disciplines of knowledge as we know them in modernity. As Maori scholar Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, in her groundbreaking book on decolonizing methodologies of 1999, tells us, such methodologies, and I quote, are not methods for revolution in a political sense, but they do provoke revolutionary thinking about the roles of knowledge, knowledge production, knowledge hierarchies, knowledge institutions that play a central role in decolonization and in social transformation. With what could provocatively be termed the significant indigenization of the international art world today, as indigenous voices are increasingly sought after for biennials, residencies, exhibitions, and art fairs, art institutions and art workers are facing the challenge of engaging meaningfully with the indigenous bid for change, at a time in which the questioning of modernity and its structures, museums amongst them, is most profoundly felt to come from current indigenous scholarship and artistic practices. And now, as we proceed with the first presentations of the day, I would like to express our delight and our appreciation for the esteemed colleagues, artists, curators, and scholars that have traveled from near and from afar to be gathered here today for Museums on Fire. Raven Chacon, Carola Gran, Gertore Holm, Anna Hudson, Eva Dagny Johansen, Jonathan Jones, Duane Linklater, Catalina Lozano, Gerald McMaster, May Olli, and Anders Sunna. And I would also like to thank the team at Oka and all of our collaborators for making the realization of this project possible. So without further ado, I would now like to hand over to our first speaker of the day, May Olli, director of the Rido Duatar Museet in Kárášjohka. Please join me in welcoming her.
Okay. The Sami people live in the Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and in Russia. I am a Sami from northern Norway. Today, the Sami live as Norwegians, but a larger proportion are involved in primary industries, such as agriculture, fishing, hunting, and reindeer herding. Reindeer husbandry is one of the Sami's traditional occupations. The Sami were therefore traditionally a nomadic people. As the Norwegian state, as did also the other nation states, Sweden and Finland, appropriated Sami territories, we were forced to become more settled. Still, some Sami activities, like reindeer herding, and some fishing, hunting, and gathering activities include elements of our traditional lifestyle. Sami parliaments have been established in all but one of the countries where the Sami lives. Norway, Sweden, and Finland have Sami parliaments, while the Russian Sami on the Koala Peninsula have not been granted such rights. In Norway, the Sami's right to protect and maintain the language, culture, and way of life was statutory by the Constitution of 1988. In 1989, the Sami parliament became established in Norway, the Sami's own elected political body. Sami parliament works for the national government and parliament as an advisory institution for them in Sami affairs. In addition, the Sami parliament have the administrative responsibility for Sami organizations and institutions, such as the Sami Museums in 2002. Sami Museums are of recent history. The first Sami Museum, Sami Workadaverat, the Sami collections opened in 1972 in Kárášjohka. Riddardotter-museet consists of 4 museums and 1 Sami art collection, with no building, but only a storage place. The locations are in 4 municipalities: Kárášjohka, Kautokeino, Porsanger, and Kvalsund. These 4 municipalities cover together an area of 23,300 square kilometers. To make this more understandable, this area is as big as the counties of Oslo, Østfold, Akershus, Vestfold, and half of Telemark. So, we have long distances between our museums. The resources allotted for running such a complex museums operations, given, for example, the geographical challenges, are largely insufficient. The distances up north show that politics shaped in the south have inexpedient outcomes in the north. Sami Workadaverat in Kárášjohka was, as mentioned, opened in 1972. This is the oldest Sami museum in Norway. After the Sami Workadaverat was opened, the work with building a Sami art museum started. Sami art has been collected by Sami Workadaverat since 1971, even though systematically organized collections towards a future Sami museum of art started in 1979. Norsk Kulturråd, the Norwegian Art Council, collected Sami art in the period from 1974 to 1992, and since 1993, Samisk Kulturråd, the Sami Art Council, has been responsible for collecting Sami art. Today, the parliament have purchasing system for contemporary art. These collections, which today consist of more than 1,300 artworks from Sami art history up to the present are now the foundation of a future Sami art museum. We have an impressive collection, but not an institution, a building, operational resources, and so on. The parliamentary inquiry, Stortingsmelding, number 61, Kultur I tiden, Culture in Time, 1991-92, discussed the importance of the involvement of the Sami society in issues that concerns them. In the case of the Sami Art Museum, it has been thoroughly discussed in various committees over the years by art experts, Sami artists, museums professionals, and Sami politicians and politicians. A committee led by Per Arne Boym delivered in 1995 the report Utredning av Samisk Kunstmuseum on deliberation of Sami Art Museum. The Norwegian Sami Parliament discussed this report about the Sami Art Museum in case number 40 in 1996 and established a new committee to work with the Boym Committee report and the questions from the Sami Parliament at that time. 2 years later, in 1997, came the new report from the Guttorm Committee called Samisk Nasjonalmuseum for Kunst- og Kulturhistorie, Sami National Museum for Art and Cultural History. This report followed the main principle from the Boym Committee work, including the co-location of the Sami Art Museum and Sami Workadaverat in Kárášjohka. This report was then sent to the Ministry of Culture. Sami Art Museum feasibility studies were planned to the Culture Ministry on the Culture Ministry long-term budgets in the period of 2003 to 2006. To make a long story short, the money from the Ministry of Culture never came. In 2009, Statsbygg, the National Company for Governmental and Public Buildings, got involved in the Sami Art Museum feasibility project, now financed by the Sami Parliament. And Statsbygg delivered a building plan in 2011. But in 2017, the Sami Art Museum is still not realized. Well, in the years of 2013-14, it was actually the Sami people themselves who stopped the process of realizing the museum. But that was after many years of ongoing process with no results. I guess that this latest conflict between the Samis themselves could never have happened if the Norwegian government could make words to action. The Sami society has worked for and waited for a Sami Art Museum for more than 40 years. Their patience was lost. But today, we stand together to establish the Sami Art Museum as planned. But why is not the Sami Art Museum realized? The thought of a Norwegian art museum in northern Norway was materialized in the 70s. Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum, the North Norwegian Art Museum, was established in 1985, with governmental funding from the same year. In 1988, Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum opened their doors in Tromsø. It was no problem realizing Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum from a thought to a physical museum financed by the government in just a little more than 10 years. Was this a discrimination, a kind of renewed Norwegianization? After 2002, it became the Sami Parliament's role to realize the Sami Art Museum. But did they ever get the resources or the funding to be able to do that? The Sami Parliament is responsible for Sami people from their birth to their death. from kindergartens, schools, the elderly, creating meeting places through the long and vast Norwegian nation. There are Sami through all of Norway. But the annual budget for the Sami parliament is not greater than the annual budget for the Norwegian National Opera. In fact, the Sami parliament has a smaller budget than the Norwegian National Opera has. Over 100 million kroners less each year. The Sami parliament is thus asked to prioritize their funds. Weighing Sami children's upbringing and care for the elderly against cultural life. The Norwegian opera work only with culture. Is this equality? Why are we, the Sami, both ignored and seen as demanding when we ask for equality? Are we a threat to Norwegian society if we can be allowed to take care of our language and our culture and make sure they prosper? Are we a threat if we, the Sami people, are acknowledged and respected in our entirety? Not only from the glossy image and self-congratulatory pronouncements of Norwegian Sami politics the government like to present abroad. We are so much more. Together with Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum, Ridderdotter-museet made the missing Sami Art Museum visible through the fixtures Sami Museum and the exhibition There Is No, that occupied the Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum location in Tromsø for 2 months. For this transformance into the fictional institution Sami Museum, Sami Art Museum, Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum got a prize this year, Museum 2017, that they shared with the not existing Sami Museum and Ridderdotter-museet. The jury pointed out that the project points out that Norwegian culture policy and cultural institutions have failed when today there is not a museum that takes special and permanent responsibility for the Sami art. Why is it important to have our own Sami Art Museum? Well, the art reflects society. Is it better that the Sami art is not seen? Is Sami art a threat and therefore not wished to be displayed and communicated from our own house? Is it fair for what the Sami art will be critical for the Scandinavian nations? Well, we are not a threat. But we ask to be allowed to attend our history, culture, and our language. Through art, show the artists what concerns them. And the Sami history of art shows a part of our common history as a minority within the majority's specified limits. And this can only be shown in a Sami Art Museum that has a wide collection that reflects society over a longer time from all the Sami areas. In a Sami museum, the Sami will themselves provide a framework for how to convey Sami art. Perhaps we prefer the outdoors inside or the art outside. Maybe we will use more colors than the policy is through the white cube model that is recognized and well-used method both nationally and internationally. Colors are important for the Sami people. See our costumes, our flag. We'll be able to use more of the diversity within our own culture and traditions to make different decisions and establish different practices that relate and manifest our culture. For comparison, look at the Sami Culture History Museum and conservation. Why are not our own traditional methods of leather treatment recognized as conservation methods to preserve artifacts which during production and use have been treated with, for example, bark water? Why should we follow laboratory techniques developed by someone who wants to sell their products, rather than our own traditional methods? Sami's knowledge is as good, if not better. All we lack is the attention to our own needs and willingness to accommodate our needs. In this case, research. Sami Art Museum will have a Sápmi perspective. Their collection currently consists of over 1,300 works by artists from all over Sápmi. We are a people in 4 countries, and that the Sami Council Conference in Trondheim in February made clear, once and for all, the vision of a common Sápmi, Oktasars Sápmi. The national boundaries are set by the nation states, but we are still one people. One people with our own vision of who we are, how we preserve our past, present, and future, and how we communicate about ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna-May. Now I would like you to join us in welcoming the second speaker of the day, Eva Dagny Johansen from the Alta Museum. Eva?
The future for ethnographic museums are discussed internationally. Presentation and communication of Sami culture and history are challenging in national and local museums. This picture engages with artifacts, collaboration, and power relations. It is from a collaborative project between my museum, the local school, and local community. The hand in the left corner is a museum hand. I used the picture to remind myself of the importance of continuously reflect on museum practice. I am currently working on my PhD thesis about the homecoming of Sami cultural heritage. In my thesis, I will take a closer look at what happens locally in the process of repatriation. As a part of the exploration of methodology, I have curated an exhibition in collaboration with the local community. I am still in early stages of my analysis, but will give you some glimpses in my work in progress. As a way to prepare for the exhibition, we arranged meetings, discussions, and information exchanges between the museum and the local community, with objects collected and taken away to national museums from our area 100 years ago. In this talk, I will focus on how repatriation of indigenous Sami objects can give new possibilities for dissemination and communicating of culture and history, Sami culture and history, in the local museum. The apparent perspectives of diversity and public debates and Norwegian cultural politics can give the impression that all voices will and can be heard. But structures seem to give space for some voices better than others. In Finnmark, it seems that colonialism persists in different ways, in encounters between people who position themselves in different ethnic categories, as Sami or Norwegian, in discourses of identity, or as indigenous people and settlers, in discourses connected to right to land. Okay, tack. In our dialogues, the struggles concerned rights to sea and fishing were debated. Arguments for local people's rights to nature is connected to Sami identity. At the same time as people by the coast struggle to find their identity within the Sami community. This is due to previous Norwegianization of the Sami population and contemporary identity markers. Contemporary discussions about language and identity, and objects and identity, can also be seen in this context. In February, media reported of a Norwegian man-created craft using traditional Sami duji technique. Although he was well skilled in making objects with traditional Sami patterns, living in a Sami community, married to a Sami woman, and having Sami children, his craft were not formally accepted as Sami duji and rejected participation in Tråante 2017. Moreover, the president of the Sami parliament was strongly criticized for performing her New Year's speech in Norwegian. The National Museum's repatriation of Sami cultural heritage from national to local museums might give new opportunities for communication and dissemination of Sami cultural heritage, culture and history in the local museums. The Norwegian repatriation process is called båstedet. This is a word from the South Sami language, translated as meaning return. The project oversees the return of objects in the Sami collection of the Norwegian Folk Museum to their areas of origin. Båstedet is an agreement between the Norwegian Folk Museum, the Museum of Cultural History, earlier Ethnographic Museum, now a part of University of Oslo, and the Sami Parliament, to repatriate 2,000 objects, half of the Sami collection in the Norwegian Folk Museum, to 6 Sami museums. My museum, Alta Museum, is not a Sami museum, but located in Sápmi. The repatriation project is based on obligation towards the Sami as indigenous people, according to national and international conventions and museum ethics, to give Sami people control over their own cultural heritage. The collection of Sami objects started by request from the World Exhibition in London in 1851. They wanted to exhibit Sami objects in the entertainment part of their exhibition and contacted the University of Oslo for assistance. In return, the university received objects collected from other indigenous groups. This was the starting point for the Ethnographic Museum in Oslo. 100 years later, the objects were transferred to the Norwegian Folk Museum. At this point in time, the Sami were considered Norwegian citizens. Most of the objects from Alta municipality and the neighboring municipalities were collected by ethnographer Ole Solberg and deacon in the Norwegian Sami mission, Bertrand Nilsen. The first one from a field trip in 1907, and the second one sent his first objects in 1910 and collected artifacts from all over Finnmark in over 40 years. I just have to check my papers still. The repatriation of indigenous artifacts made by museums offer the opportunity to engage in rewarding collaboration projects between museum and local communities. Moreover, repatriation can in itself contribute in initiating dialogues where there is a possibility to renegotiate existing power relations between the Norwegian majority and the Sami minority, and between different Sami groups. I will use the concept repatriation in this presentation, meaning the return of cultural heritage to indigenous people having lost essential parts of their cultural heritage as a consequence of colonialism. By opening up the museum and establishing the museum as contact zones, new relations can be negotiated and different systems of knowledge can be made visible, as described by James Clifford. Mary-Louise Pratt's term concept zone, Clifford uses Mary-Louise Pratt's term concept zone, by which she used to describe the space of imperial encounters, the space in which people geographically and historically separated come into contact with each other and establish ongoing relation, usually involving condition of coercion, radical inequality, intractable conflict. Despite inequalities in power relation and possible contradictory interests, museums might function as arenas that allow for indigenization of museum practice and an opportunity to explore community engagement. In Alta, we opened the exhibition Nah Maidal, Our Cultural Heritage Heading Home, in February, which present objects that are part of the Bostede project, along with objects from our own collection at Alta Museum and private collections. When displaying these objects together, it was important for the local contributors to introduce visitors to our local cultural heritage, particularly the Sea Sami heritage. The Sea Sami in this area have historically lived on hunting, trapping, gathering and fishing, and eventually commercial fishing, animal husbandry and agriculture. Living off the sea became more difficult after the Second World War, and some Sea Sami areas have nearly been depopulated. However, today people are increasingly returning to a former practice of proudly showing their Sami belonging and identity in public. Alta is an ethnic and culturally complex community and the largest town in Finnmark. It is a university town and students from all over Finnmark are coming to Alta. The museum building is located in the bottom of the Alta fjord, by the sea, close to the rock carvings sites on the UNESCO World Heritage List. The history and prehistory are telling about a popular meeting place since the Stone Age. The area has been occupied by Sami people as long as we can tell by different findings, by both Norwegian and Samis from the 1200s, and from 1700s also other groups such as Kvans, immigrants from Finland. The museum is responsible for displaying and communicating Alta's world heritage, the rock carvings, and the town's local history and culture. Alta Museum's main exhibition from 1991 was criticized for communicating a division between different ethnic groups, locating the Norwegian by the coast and the Sami on the inland. When analyzing exhibitions representing Sami culture and heritage, narrative structures that reproduce stereotypical images of Sami people are often identified. In a collaboration project focusing on diversity and opening up for voices from the local population, we expected a more nuanced story and more diverse responses from our audience. Museums are collecting artifacts, and we wanted to find out what and why local people are collecting, and how they disseminate their stories. This is an example that we found. Mattis Oskal is a reindeer herder from Kautokeino, and in their family they have taken care of a ridespagat. It's what the child is holding her hands, for the children to sit safe on the reindeer. This was made by Oskal's grandfather as a gift to his son, Oskal's father, when he was born. Sitting on the back of the reindeer gave close contact between the child and the animal. This is how Mattis introduces children from kindergarten to important values in the Sami culture. Eli Høydalsnes has argued that hegemonic discourses structures images of Sápmi, and narratives affected by the semantic of the Sami iconography reproduces difference where we also could find similarities. Høydalsnes referred to Johannes Scheffer's Laponia, dominating the visual representation of Sápmi up to 1800. I could find the same image on postcard in our museum shop. The image is connected to hegemonic discourses and reproduces stories of who the Sami people are. This dilemma is part of the phenomenon or practice of autoethnography, a concept by Mary-Louise Pratt, where the others, in meeting with dominated representations, use the colonizer's language and aesthetics in self-representation. The contact zone can change the discourse of identity markers and explain how both museums and local communities are actors in a practice where different groups and individuals can be included in representing and negotiating their own culture, identity, and belonging. This picture was taken by Sofus Tromholt during his stay in Finnmark in the first International Polar Year, 1882 to 1883. His scientific project was the Northern Light, but he also photographed the landscape and the Sami people. The photo collection is also included in the UNESCO's Memory of the World. In the same period, in 1889, there was a national policy to assimilate the Sami culturally and for the immigration Kven population of Finnmark. The national church and the school system had central roles in initiating the goal of the state, Christianity and Norwegian language. The coastal area were the first to be colonialized. In the interior, where the Sami made up the majority, the impact of the Norwegian culture was less direct. At the end of the World War II, most buildings in the county were burned down by the German army. The population was evacuated to the south, and when they returned, most of the coastal population saw their future as Norwegian, regardless of their former belonging. Their houses were rebuilt in Norwegian style, and the material representation of the Sea Sami culture became invisible. This picture is of the same photographer at the same period, 1883, from a small settlement in the Alta fjord. And the social anthropologist Harald Eidheim describes the same settlement in the 1960s as appearing to outsiders without any distinctive ethnic features. Clothing, food, houses, social institutions, ideals, and values appeared to be as in every northern Norwegian community. However, insiders knew most of the people were a kind of Sami, as some of his informants told him. The research on Sami culture at this time saw the Sea Sami culture as belonging to the past. The turning point for the Sami political organization and common opinion of the Sami people came with the Alta conflict. The protests against the Act of Parliament, which allowed the building of hydroelectric power installation in the Alta River. This was the most controversial development of hydroelectric power in Norway, and raised questions concerning the right of indigenous peoples in Norway. Sami political organization intensified the political processes and struggles to get Sami culture and language equal to Norwegian culture. The Alta affair was, as it is said before today, prominent from 1979 to 1982, and during this period, Sami political matters were often subject of both Norwegian and foreign newspapers. Since this period, the question concerned whether the Samis have legitimate demands regarding special rights within the Norwegian state has been a permanent topic of discussion in Norwegian and Sami affairs. The protests started with protection of nature. This was the second case in Norway where actionists were willing to conduct civil disobedience to protect nature. The Alta affair united locals, environmentalists, academics, and Sami people. Samis get support from indigenous people around the world. There were protests against the destruction of the nature and living conditions along the river valley and moorland, and a renewed focus on Sami rights as a minority and indigenous groups. Yes. In dissemination of this conflict, school children in Alta are they themselves playing the Alta affair. Here are actionists at the point zero. And here is a conflict in front of the Norwegian Parliament, you can see in the background. For the Norwegian authorities who elsewhere campaigned for international human rights, it was impossible to overlook this situation. This international focus on Sami rights in Norway. The Sami are regarded as an indigenous people. The status of the Sami was written into the Norwegian constitution in 1988, and the Sami parliament opened in 1989. Despite the success that has been achieved by the Sami political movements, many were, and still some are, skeptical concerned the political version of the Sami identity or an official Saminess with regard to special rights and the Sami parliament. This may be considered in the context of the debate concerning the land and water rights, and how this affects areas in which people's self-identity is complex. People have Sami, Kven, and Norwegian roots. Until recently, local resistance occurred in Alta when Sami symbols are brought into new public contexts. Sami culture is usually relegated to the interior or to private sphere in everyday life. Thus, when Sami symbols are brought into new contexts, they create a possibility for a new and modern ways of expressing Sami identity. Therefore, in the town of Alta, there is a continuous struggle over where the Sami culture is to be located. Kjell Olsen has formulated a crucial question for this struggle. If a Sami culture is knowledge, performances, and symbols that belong to the interior and have disappeared at the coast, is it still possible to regard the local everyday life in Alta as a part of a collective Sami self-understanding? This was also a question we debated within the focus group during the exhibition project. Nah Maidal, our Sami cultural heritage heading home. Nah Maidal is in North Sami language and can be translated meaning know what. In our focus group, we had also invited Yvonne Normanset, an artist from Alta living in Oslo. She made this one for the exhibition. It depicts a meeting between the wild and domestic, between a rock ptarmigan and a chicken or a rooster. Yvonne says she uses her background in her art. She is from a Sami family on her mother's side, but had no knowledge of this until she was an adult. She says she grew up as a Norwegian. The work is called Domestic Violence, What's Broken Cannot Be Fixed. We can see details in her work from artifacts displayed in the exhibition. The focus group selected 7 objects from Båstede for the exhibition. It was important for them that all the objects were Sami artifacts to make this cultural heritage visible. They focused on the handicraft, the patterns and skills, and local practice and living culture. This Sami costume, gakti in Sami and kofte in Norwegian, was purchased in Øksfjord's Sami community, or coastal Sami community, in 1910 by Bertrand Nilsen, and he paid 13 kroner for the costume. It is made out of cloth, and the sleeves have woven bands at them. In the 1980s, the gakti served as the design prototype for what has become the gakti of Loppa, Kvænangen, and Alta municipalities. Today, there are frequent and well-attended gakti sewing courses, and locals have begun wearing the gakti again. The Sami costume, reindeer, lavo, joik, is the most prominent of the national symbols of the Sami. It represents the history of the Sami people and is an important part of the national identity. The pieces of clothing included in the costume, as well as the way it is adorned, indicate which part of the homeland the bearer comes from. This Sami gakti in the picture with a girl is the one as it is reconstructed, became reconstructed in the 1980s. This is part of the Kokel gakti, who was one of the first Sami costumes to be reconstructed. This gakti was a part of a traveling exhibition in coastal Sami areas, and Gry Fors og Ragnhild Enoksen, who made this exhibition, told that it made people glow of recognition in the middle of the 80s when they traveled with it. In showing a continuity between the past and the present, one of the members of the focus group brought family pictures to the exhibition. Bente Sjursen, she's to the left, has made this gakti for herself, the red one, and for her cousin Hilde Søra, in the middle, in the picture to the left. Hilde grew up in Alta and didn't know her father had Sami language as his mother tongue until she was an adult. The patterns of these mikabats can be found in other types of decorative objects and utensils in our area, in woodwork as well as in objects made of horn and bone. Such boxes were made in many sizes, from small butter canisters to larger freight cases. Like other forms of woodwork and objects made of bone and horn, the boxes were decorated with engravings and wood cuttings. The knife was often the only tool used to make them, and the patterns are recurrent. Here, the adornment include traditional Sami patterns. The upper rim features simple geometrical patterns between parallel lines and the zigzag pattern open to one side, forming a continuous row of triangles. The area's gakti display similar patterns in the trimmings on the collars and down in the holby, in the bottom of the gakti's skirt. In meeting with these objects, the focus group recognized the patterns, and we had discussions on the importance of objects being present in the local community, for knowledge of local heritage, inspiration for revitalization of local craft, and consciousness of the local Sea Sami heritage. The objects are exhibited in glass boxes due to preservation, safety, and climate demands. In the background in this picture, you can see Yvonne Normandset's work. It's called Rootless. Her art, in relation to the cultural historic artifacts, put focus on identity as complex and ambiguous. Everyday objects taken out of the local community 100 years ago were decontextualized as museum objects in a new system of knowledge, representing Sami culture. When they are back in the local community, they are not returning to the community they left, but recontextualized in new social and political settings for new needs. Here, according to indigenous perspectives and indigenous museological approaches. This horn from a Sami woman's bonnet, this is a horn from a Sami woman's bonnet. In 1910, Bertram Nilsen sent one woman's bonnet in use in the beginning of the 19th century and one horn. The bonnet has been lost, but the horn might be this one, the records in Norwegian Folk Museum says. In the same photograph as I showed you earlier, we can see Anne Olsdotter with the bonnet horn. 18th century missionaries wrote that the Sami had signed a pact with the devil and believed that all Sami cultural expressions and beliefs were the devil's work. Their name for the decorated Sami drums was the Devil's Bible. Such drums were either destroyed or confiscated and sent to Copenhagen, where they vanished when the city burned. Likewise, the woman's horn bonnets were banned. The horn was thought to be a hiding place for the devil. Here's another of Yvonne Normandset's work, hidden agenda, and all kinds of things are popping up from the bonnet horn. This Ned needle was acquired by Ole Solberg in Rafsbotn, Alta, in 1907. It is made of horn or bone and has been marked with someone's initials. It was used to tie and mend fishnets before nylon nets became habitual. In the focus group, we discussed the possibility to find out who's the initials, who made this net needle, and how it was used. But we also discussed questions about sustainable living in local Sea Sami communities. Cod fishing collapsed in the 1980s, and from the 19th onward, fishing boats had to comply with fixed quotas. The cod crisis coincided with annual seal invasion that drove the cod further out and away from the fjords. This meant that only those able to fish further out at sea were able to catch fish and secure quotas for themselves. This was a dramatic turn for fjord fishers who lost their fishing right, except a share in a collective quota. Museums can be used as showcases for cultural heritage in debates and struggles for rights. Now the fish has returned to the fjords, and there is good money in fishing, although it remains difficult for young people to become self-sustaining fishermen. Boats and quotas are expensive, and there are few local fish processing plants. Seeing objects in their original area adds to their stories, said a foreign guest visiting our exhibition. According to the Båstede project, these objects that we have borrowed to our exhibition will be repatriated to the Sami Museum in Kárášjohka, Restitution Museum, May Museum. During the collaboration process, members of the focus group questioned and discussed this decision that the objects belonging to the coast area should be repatriated to an inland Sami museum. During the collaboration project, showing the artifacts, increasing local consciousness, sharing knowledge, and encouraging mutual respect all became more important than ownership of objects. Alta Museum is now in a process with Restitution Museum, and the objects might be located at our museum. The repatriation of artifacts from national museums give the local museum possibility to open up for important values and help us to renegotiate identity, history, rights, and belonging in our contemporary local community. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much to Eva for that presentation. We're now going to go straight on to discussion between us and open up fairly quickly to a question and answer with all of you. I want to start with, well, first of all, thank you very much for both of your presentations. I think they've given us a very rich context from which to view the whole of this symposium. And let's dig a little deeper into some of the issues that you've raised. I'd like to start with Eva and your project for repatriation and the processes that that involves. I wondered if you could give us a little bit more information about how some of those processes took place. How did you work with a particular family? How did you identify that group? What conversations did you have with them? What resulted from that?
Well, I have been working at Alta Museum since 2003, actually. So during this period, I have been working in different ways to engage local communities. In earlier projects, we had collaboration with schools, and then the students has had contact with their families. So we have got contact with a wide range of people through the pupils in the schools. Well, during my years, I have an idea of who I can contact. So I started to contact some, and we discussed who else could be relevant to include in the group. So we kind of established a group through in that way. And we worked from, we started our first meeting in October and went on until January, first days of January. The exhibition opened in February the 2nd. So we had regular meetings during this period where I put up the meetings and put up different questions and concerns I thought it was important to discuss in the meeting. And I think we had about 8 meetings during this period, and then contact on emails and telephone. I don't know if that was...
Yeah, and maybe here we can bring in Anna May, since there is a dialogue between the institutions during this process. I was wondering, the feedback, the conversations, the dialogues that you've been having with those families, with those groups, is that in any way connected or fed back to your institution in terms of when the objects then come back to you, how that dialogue might be surrounding those objects, or how you might use that in some way? What's been the relationship between both of your institutions around those processes?
Okay. It was obvious this discussion would come in our focus group because, well, repatriation of objects being apart from the communities for 100 years, and the idea is to bring them to their original areas. So it's a kind of, logic mismatch. So when we started to discuss this, I just took contact with Ridderdotter Museum and discussed with them how they was thinking about the case in their relation to the Norwegian Folk Museum, and we have this very constructive discussions going on. So yeah.
And you've mentioned that actually, as a result of that discussion, with regards to it's called Sami, some of the objects might stay in the Alta Museum. Could you tell us a bit more about that side of the discussion?
The importance with these objects is to show that the Samis have been not only in the areas that probably are the strongest Sami areas, it's also in the smaller areas. And it's important to have the objects in those areas that have the weakest identity, you may say the weakest Sami identities. So to have the objects in Alta makes the Sami people there to have this forankring. Lack of English words. I don't know the English word. The foundation in this area, and if it's hard to remember everything. The artifacts from Loppa, because there isn't any museum in Loppa, and the Alta Museum is actually the museum that is closest to the area where the objects come from. We also see the Eastern Sami. The Sami museums have borrowed objects to the new museum that is coming in the Eastern Finnmark in Neiden. So it's important to show the Samis have been all over Finnmark, all over Norway, even a lot souther than the, well, like some people like to think we find. So you see, the objects is, you may say, we don't have a tradition for write our history like the majority has had, but the objects can show that we actually have been a lot more south than people would like to know.
Thanks. Now, Eva, my last question to you is thinking about the question of reconciliation, which is a process that hasn't really happened across the length of the country. The king, of course, gave his apology, which was when? Could you remind me? 1990. So that was a public apology, but there haven't been long, broad, socially based processes of reconciliation, as there may have been in other conflict regions across the world. So your work in repatriation, do you think there have been extra challenges to that as a result of not having a foundation, in a way, from which to go? Do you feel that perhaps even the repatriation is a part of a reconciliation? How far do you think it's impacting a broader aspect of Norwegian society?
Of course, it could be easier to initiate projects like this if it was a national project. Yes, I think that's reasonable. But anyway, we in the museums in Norway we have had focus on community engagement, diversity, bringing up diverse voices. So in a way, the perspectives have been there, but the problematics that we face in these areas might not have been really brought forward nationally, but it might come.
Yeah, hopefully it will come. And Anna-Maja, I want to come back to you now. You gave us a very precise and succinct outline for the history of the collection, of the museum, the political history, how the debates and discussions have been structured, in the parliaments in Oslo and the Sápmi parliament. Perhaps we could think about the future. And with regards to the project for the Sami Museum, what strategies do you think are important to get to that stage? How do you think you can activate politically and socially across Norway, in the heart in Oslo, which is at the end of the day the one making those decisions, political and monetary? And how can the art world also be activated to lobby for that?
Well, yeah, I was on the National Museum meeting or conference in Fredrikstad in the last week of March. And we did discuss that theme at that meeting. And I did ask the question, isn't it a responsibility for a museum that called itself in their name national? The Samis is a part of this nation. So actually the National Museum in Oslo have a responsibility to make sure that our art and our history, our culture is known all over Norway. Not only Norway, but also all over Scandinavia and also the world. So we have the expectations that the National Museum will also in their what do you call it? Main exhibitions also have the Sami arts in the exhibitions, but also that they are working with what do you call it, when they are making traveling exhibitions, also to include the Sami art in those. We have also have some discussion that actually we had a pop-up in Tromsø, the Sami Museum in Tromsø for 2 months, and the exhibition There Is No. And actually, the media in the south actually did not mention us at all, maybe a sentence here and there, but I actually haven't said it or read it or heard about it. And that's we actually got the this year museum prize at the National Museum conference. And actually, I haven't seen anything about that in the news either. So I think that we have a problem that actually it seems like what's happening in North it's only happening in North, and probably the North is not a part of the Norway. So we need to get attention. So actually I have some plans. If Oka wants to help me, I can get a pop-up here too.
So I think perhaps now is a good time to open up to all of you. Is there somebody with a mic who can take it around in case people want to ask? Any questions, please?
Just following Katya's lead on the Museum of the Future and remembering previous conversations, it is perhaps very interesting to listen from you the complexity with which the museum, the Sami Museum started, which was not only a collection-based museum, but much more with the magazine and the radio. And if you envision that that's also the plan of a possible constellation of a Sami Museum of the future.
Can you repeat that question?
Perhaps just because it didn't come out during your presentation, but I think it's a beautiful story of how the museum early started, which was the house of a political party and the radio, the magazine. And I think it's a very beautiful part of the story of the museum, which, and I'm just wondering if, in thinking also the museum of the future, if that part will be also kind of in your planning or in your imagining that museum for the future, how that will be kind of incorporated or taken into account.
Well, now I'm hanging with you. The Sami Workadabarat was established in 1972 and had a lot of roles. It was the meeting place. It has the Sami radio. The Sami radio actually started there. A lot of political parties started there. We had all the Sami activities happening in that building because it was the first Sami building at all. So it was a lot of roles for that museum, and the people in Kárášjohka and also in Finnmark have missed it. It's like that meeting place, that connection between the people, connection between the different roles the Samis have to had. We also had a library there. Yes. We have that in our plans. We actually are thinking about which kind of solutions we have to include the children again. Like, is it possible that if we get the, what do you call it? This kind of a room, audio studio room, something. We have the possibilities to have the after-school service activities for kids, also the culture school activities for the kids. So we get the people back to the museums, to the activities, to get them, so we can have the frame around building up the proudness of who we are. And I think that if we are able to get that back, we actually are doing something good with replacing, or not replacing, we are building up a bigger museum with a, you can call it a stronger foundation, because we are building up the generations that is coming, not only the generations that have been gone. So the museum will be a place where the past meets the future. Thank you.
Any other questions before we move on to our coffee break?
Hi. I have two questions. They're more sort of disciplinary questions rather than specifically about the Sami context that was brought up. The first question is, if we took the example of two 19th century formations of museums that weren't in a building, not in an imperishable structure, but more the formation of a nature reserve. And I give you two examples, one in the 19th century in India in 1864, where indigenous populated areas were converted into a nature reserve to sort of propagate the wilderness myth that no one ever lived there, there was no culture there. And it was also the beginning of a kind of nature tourism industry. The second example was the formation of Yosemite Park in the United States. Those are natural contexts, but essentially, in my view, they're more like museums, the formation of a museum, a cultural museum dedicated to nature. So in that context, how would a non-colonial museum look like if we were to take the context purely of nature? How would one talk about that kind of museum? The second question is, I've been working on nuclear landscape photography in Australia, Canada, India, and Japan. And one of the issues that comes up in Australia is the repatriation of Aboriginal memories, not Aboriginal objects, but Aboriginal memories that were destroyed between 1945 and 56 during the nuclear tests that were conducted by the British on Australian soil. There's an artist who's working there now on the repatriation of memories, and the way that's being done is using archives that are filmed with sound archives, sound and footage, films, photography, to create a kind of moving image museum and sort of mobile archive. So here we are talking really about the repatriation of memories rather than objects. And I'm wondering if you have that kind of project, perhaps, maybe in the offing, in the Sami context. I'm sorry I have two separate questions, but just thought I'd ask them. Thank you.
I'm maybe going to take the opportunity to respond to both of your questions briefly, and then maybe pass over to Eva and to Anna-May. When it comes to the 19th century museum format of the Nature Museum, you talk about Yosemite Park. How would you do that today, is the question. And I think certainly one of the things that you would not do today, which they are doing in Yosemite Park, is the erasure of history, is the erasure of the indigenous history of the Yosemite Park. I think I'm going to pronounce it properly. The indigenous population was called Awanatchi, I think. I've got it written down somewhere. What's fascinating when you go to Yosemite Park and you travel around, one of the most important places of Yosemite Park is something called Mariposa Grove. And Mariposa Grove is where the most important sequoia trees are, and they all have their different stories and tales associated to them. These days, when you go to Yosemite Park, there are big sections about controlled fire burning in Yosemite. What nobody really tells you is that the reason why those controlled fire burnings were instituted, I think they started to be instituted in the 60s, is because there came a sort of ecological crisis point in Yosemite Park where actually the trees were burning and they were kind of out of control. The reason for that is because, back in the 19th century, I think it was, or maybe it was much earlier than that, precisely the indigenous communities were massacred by the incoming settlers. The Mariposa Grove is in fact named after the Mariposa Brigade of settlers that came in with the United States Army to wipe out those communities or to force them into signing treaties. And in the wiping out of those communities, what happened is you wiped out their knowledge of how to manage and maintain those forests, and particularly the sequoia groves and the oak tree groves. Fire is in fact, and in fact Yosemite is one of the, and the treatment of fire there has been one of the inspirations for this title, for Museums on Fire, because fire is in fact the only way in which the sequoia nuts will actually open up to release their seeds and to germinate. You need fire for that to happen, and that was one of the reasons for the ecological disasters of those forests. So to bring it back to the points, bringing back those indigenous histories into nature, whatever those museum natures might be, would certainly be one of the things to bear in mind. When it comes to your second question, you talk about memories and how those memories reinstituted or recovered. And I'm sure here, Anna-May, you can talk about a lot with regards to that. I would just simply mention the yoik. The yoik is, without a doubt, one of those protocols within which the memory of habitation, of places and of people, the memory of people is somehow kept. And I have had some conversations with a yoiker, an artist, a professor of law at Tromsø University, Anders Sunna, about how the yoik could potentially be used as a legal document in court, as a way to testify for Sami presence in lands that of course have no paper documentation. So that kind of memory is an interesting one. But I think you know much more about Joik than I do, and perhaps that could be one thing that you could talk about.
Well, yeah, I can talk about that, but I can also talk about a lot of other things. We have knowledge that is passed from parent or grandparents to the children. It's not written. It's like we have. What I was thinking about when you take, if you're going to take the nature in the museum, it's actually taking the knowledge into the museum. It's taking. It's what I was talking about earlier. The knowledge. Why are we using the knowledge that is created somewhere else? Why are we not using the knowledge that are created in our own places, from our own nature? Like bark water I was talking about, that's completely nature produced. I don't know, find the English word for it, but to make the leather soft again. So why are we using other elements than our own nature? The Samis have a lot of knowledge how to survive in cold areas, how to dress to survive, how to make the reindeer fur warm and comfortable. And that kind of knowledge, to use that in the museums, also actually make our own traditional knowledge alive again. Because it's so easy to go to the store and buy something instead of go to the nature and get what you need. So I think that taking the nature inside is also to take the knowledge inside. I don't know if that's the answer for your question, but that's what I was thinking about. And also, yeah, Joik are telling stories. Stories that are not written. Stories that is not in the picture. It's about a feeling. It's about something deeper. And actually, the different families and have their own way of telling the stories. It's quite difficult to talk about this in English, though. So I don't know if I'm answering your questions, but that was what I was thinking about.
Yeah, well, I would like to put focus on the possibilities in the museum's institutions. I think the museums could have opportunities to change their practice by opening up for collaboration with local communities. And like my experience is, it will mean that we put focus on not on how many visitors are coming to the museum, but how can we contribute to needs in the local communities. And if memory work is a part of the needs, then I think we could develop methods inside the museum institution to develop practice to cope with these challenges. Yes.
Hello, thank you, Gitte. I just want to comment also on, you were talking about memory work. Thinking also about the debate about, or the place names, stedsnamn, things that are going on in Norway and Sápmi right now, with regards to going back and tracing the oral tradition of place names all over Sápmi in Norway that have Sami or, Kven or other origin, and getting them back on the maps is also a part of that storytelling, because in that cultural naming, there are stories of the land and how you feed and how you relate to nature and how you survive. So that's, I guess, is also kind of part of that.
I just agree. No.
So thanks very much. I think we're going to wrap it up there. And I encourage you all to go and get some coffee, some refreshments, and then we'll go on to the second part of the symposium. Thanks very much.